Keep in touch with the Wolf Connection podcast on our Instagram handle at the Wolf Connection Pod, or email us your questions, comments, and guest ideas to podcast@wolfconnection.org. Thank you for your support, and howls to you all. Welcome to the Wolf Connection podcast. I'm your host, John Kaufman. All right, so we're fresh off the Yellowstone Wolf Summit, and Stephen and I, we've been trying to get this individual on for a little while, though she is, to be fair, pretty much everywhere across the world, teaching, giving speeches. We met her first in Aspen when we did our Living with Wolves, coexistence with wolves with Aspen Environmental Center there. We saw her again at the Yellowstone Wolf Summit, and now we have her here on the podcast. She's a professor of environmental studies for around 25 years. She's a faculty in ecology and evolutionary biology at the University of Colorado, Boulder, master instructor, Yellowstone Institute, a board member and senior science advisor for the Rocky Mountain Wolf Project. She is Joanna Lambert. Joanna, it's great to see you again. It was good to see you in person twice now. How's everything going with you?
Well, hi, you guys. Hi, John. Hi, Steve. It's great to be here. I'm glad we were able to coalesce all at the same time at the same place. It's not easy in this busy world that we live in, but it's good to see you.
Yeah.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
Of course, yeah. And I mean, anybody who's done any research on you and noticed, I was just looking through the pamphlet at the summit, and you do a lot of work with primates in Africa. You've been in Africa for the most part, working with wolves in the Rocky Mountains. Those have really been your two key focuses at this point. Just give everyone a little bit of background, because I didn't know this about you, that you were born in England, I think, and you immigrated over here to the United States. Just give everyone an idea of that background of your life and what it was like to move here, and then really to get into your scientific background, your scientific studies of working with animals and doing that research.
Yeah, thank you for asking. So yes, I'm an immigrant, moved over when I was young. My parents came over for the same reasons that many folks, emigrate to the United States. They wanted a piece of the American dream, right? So moved over to Chicago, of all places. I recall my grandparents having concern about us getting gunned down, and I'm not kidding, gunned down in the streets of Chicago by gangsters. That was very much a prevalent imagery in England in the 70s. So I moved from one big city to another. I born and raised in Oxford, England, moved over to Chicago. And, people have asked me, how did you end up becoming a wildlife person, an animal behavior person? And I sort of bogged down because I don't have a great story. I don't, it was nothing that my parents gave me. My parents, I wasn't around people that loved animals and wildlife. I was not introduced to anything of the natural world. I was just a little kid that loved seeking out things that were wild and alive. And I did that, growing up in cities. And so this involved, once I came over to the States, observing even cottontail rabbits that make a living in urban and semi-urban areas, tree squirrels, various birds. My entree into the world of wildlife was birds. And I do think that for many people, birds are a great way of learning about a whole different world other than Homo sapien. And so when I was young, I just fell in love with all things, avian. I did somehow get my hands on a book called Birds of Prey. And from there, I decided to create my own Birds of Prey club, which included exactly one member, which was myself. And so what I did as a young girl was study in books the behavior of birds of prey. I memorized their Latin names. It was just something that I did. But I don't know where it comes from, and it speaks to the question, I think, of that endemic sort of love of wildlife that some people just seem to have more than others. I think inherently we are all, every single one of us are dialed in and wired in sort of neurophysiologically the the world of the wild, but then there are a few individuals that may sort of tap into that more than others. So there is absolutely an inborn piece of this. And as I grew up in kind of an urban world, it was always animals. It was animals that I drew. It was animals that I thought about. Now, in the world that I grew up in the family that I grew up in, it never occurred to me, and I never even knew, for that matter, that you could make a living doing it. That I could make a living studying animals. It actually, I didn't really know about it until after high school. And it was in college that I started very seriously taking courses in zoology and, doing everything that I could to get into the world of wildlife and animals. I volunteered for every lab. I volunteered for every project that I could. I was the kid on Christmas Day coming in, to oversee the sloth colony in, the Department of Zoology. I was the kid that was coming in on Thanksgiving to do this reproductive cycling study on a little rodent from Chile called Phyllodes darwini. So I was scrappy, and as a consequence, at the end of my undergrad, I had a professor approach me and say, Lambert, you've paid your dues, man. And I'm looking for a field tech to go to Equatorial Africa. Would you be interested? And to say that I was interested was sort of an understatement. I probably almost passed out with delight, and it just ecstasy of the thought of going to Africa, which is something that I had always wanted to do. And sure enough, I went, and where I went was to this remarkable forest that I have continued to work in for subsequent 33 years. And this is a forest that is at the border of the Democratic Republic of Congo and Western Uganda. It's a high altitude rainforest that has the most biomass of primates anywhere on Earth. So it's an extraordinary place to land. It's incredibly biodiverse. And I had done some field work as an undergrad, some rodent work, some rabbit work. But man, getting boots on the ground field experience in that forest, dodging forest elephants and, forest cobra and, running after unhabituated chimpanzees as a first experience was mind blowing. And I just knew I needed more. So the sort of the rest is history, I guess. I had that taste of what it could be like. It's hard as hell. I had no money. And so everything that I brought with me to Africa, I got, at the Salvation Army, a lot of Army surplus stuff, this ancient gear, everything leaked. I lived in a tent. Everything that could go wrong did go wrong, with illness and just all kinds of stuff, but I couldn't get enough of it. And so went back and continue to go back, and will always have a piece of my heart and my soul at that site. I've also worked at multiple other sites. As it turns out, I've now studied and observed animals on basically every continent, and just had an extraordinary experience in so doing. And I'm just thankful to that individual, a professor named Dan Gibo, who took a chance with me. And so I guess, so I don't have the story of, oh, I met Jane Goodall when I was 10. And that's what everybody wants to hear, right? They want to hear that there was that moment. It wasn't like that. Animals have always been part of my what I always say, the animals and what the wild is just woven into my tissue. It's woven, it's a part of my bodily integument, if you will, to be with animals. And that's what I do. And I'm old school. The way that, I mean, I now integrate genomics and all kinds of lab stuff, but the way that I come to know animals is just boots on the ground.
And of course, you're saying you don't have a story, but it sounds like a really interesting one to me. But it's still almost simplifying like what you do on stage when you're giving these speeches, because it's not just wildlife behavior or you know the basics. You're integrating nutritional ecology, evolution, phenotyping. It's such a complex network of information and knowledge. How do you get into things like that, which on their own seem like lifelong studies? I mean, how do you integrate things like that? Nutritional ecology, evolution, phenotyping. But it seems like a challenge to integrate all of these things. So how do you go about doing that?
Thank you. I appreciate that question. And gosh, it's crazy because you hardly ever get these kinds of questions, right? And I feel it's like a tell-all. But I appreciate the question. So, in terms of the training, I did go on to get a master's of science and then a PhD. And then I completed 2 postdoctoral fellowships. And so, there were many, many years of just literally just training, right? And education, doing the work. And I am grateful for all of that. I mean, what a privilege, right? To be able to do that. I got my way through school as an undergrad. I had my own house cleaning business. So I always say I clean toilets to study animals, wow. Man. That's how I got through undergrad. But then by the time you get to, graduate school, there are things like fellowships and teaching assistantships. So I had my training and I got excellent training. My PhD was at University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, one of the finest research universities in the country. I did postdoctoral fellowships at University of Florida in zoology and then UCLA in ecophysiology. So I got great training, but in terms of like pulling it all together, I have always been drawn to this question of scale. And and as a consequence, I'm described as something called an integrative biologist, which means I am interested in things that are living from all scales, from the physiological, like the smallest scale, to the individual, to the species, to to communities of species, up to ecosystems. So I am an integrative kind of thinker and scholar. And you're right. I mean, my work now involves individual physiology in terms of hormones and various and microbiome and behavior, all the way up to kind of implications for species interactions in ecosystems. So yeah. It's kind of a big package.
Yeah, it is. What I find fascinating just in the first few minutes that we're talking is that you've emigrated to the United States from one urban setting to another, and then from that urban setting in Chicago, you have diversified yourself into all of these remote areas across the planet. Was that something that was inside of you the whole time, that you want to go to the far reaches of the earth to study these animals and be outside? But meanwhile, studying, and a lot of your research, what we'll get into, is studying these animals in these urban settings and how they're correlating. But firstly, what was that like, just to sort of blossom and expand to all these corners of the earth from these urban settings for you?
Yeah, no, thank you. That's a great question. So I think there's a subset of crazies out there, and that I'm one of them, I guess. I can't get far enough away from people. I love humanity. I love humans. I love hanging out, but as soon as I can, I want to get away from them. So I don't know what that's all about. But yeah, I have always yearned for wild spaces. And I think ultimately, as I mentioned at the outset, I think ultimately all of us have that. I think the longer, the more urban our world becomes, the more distant we are from that yearning. But I do believe it's in us all. And the difference between me and others maybe is that I just went out there and just did it. And so up until recently, and we can certainly talk about that because it involves wolves and coyotes. Up until recently, all of my work has been in very, very remote places. Places where I was worried about whether I could get water, or any kind of medical attention, but yeah, that's sort of that part of the story, I guess.
I mean, just let's go into, because I want to get first your, because I'll just sort of jump into research, and because we first met you in Aspen when we were doing the Living with Wolves, the coexistence event that was being held there, which from our point of view, at least for myself, being up there and moderating, which was a little bit, it was a big task in and of itself, because you're all titans of where you were with Matt Yamashita, yourself, Matt Barnes. Everybody was really focused on getting their story across and doing a wonderful job at it. How did you feel that event went off in terms of, did you feel the audience, got the gist of what was happening, and they understood the information that was being there? Your presentation really kicked it off quite nicely for about 25 minutes before we got to the panel. Just walk everybody else through that for you, and what the sort of reception you got as that event sort of ended and you were able to talk to some people afterwards.
I thought it was a beautiful event. And I was in love with Aspen that night, quite honestly. That sounds, whatever, but it's absolutely the case. I feel like the audience was receptive. I do know that there was a diverse crowd in there. Overarchingly, my sense was that the folks in there, they were an already sold audience. There were a lot of wildlife lovers in there. But then, as you know, this whole event was oriented to educating about, all things Canis lupus. And I do know that there are a number of folks that don't want wolves in that area and of Aspen. And that region indeed is, one of the areas that has been identified by Colorado Parks and Wildlife as being one of the earlier release sites in the reintroduction. So I was fully aware of the diversity of, my audience members, but what I loved about it is that I've done enough big lectures, I guess, over the years to have a feel for some of this. My gut was telling me that this was an audience that was open to hearing some stuff, and learning and not coming in with a closed mind. I think that, the Aspen Institute for the Environment did a fantastic job. I think the compilation of people, the whole sequence of events was beautifully done. And I did get, after my lecture, I got a lot of feedback over email. People were reaching out to me and thanking me for the lecture, thanking me, for the content of my lecture, as you know, because you were there. And I believe that some parts of that evening have already been, you guys have already had on your podcast series. But my talk was not sort of what is a wolf kind of thing. It was more big picture. And as you know, it started, 800,000 years ago with the history of when and where wolves evolved and the timing of when humans first ran into wolves in Eurasia about 60,000 years ago. So, I was endeavoring to make it as non-threatening and big picture as possible. and ultimately, concluded with the significance of the Colorado restoration of wolves to the Western Slope. But, I was very, very consciously trying to situate that within the bigger picture of humans and our interactions with wild animals over deeper time. And I think it worked just based on, feedback that I've had from that. And then it was great to be able to segue from that into the kind of nuts and bolts stuff that you were, fielding in that panel, representatives from Colorado Parks and Wildlife, representatives from the Rocky Mountain Wolf Project, et cetera. I think that, it was just a nice combination.
Yeah, your content is like you said, it's so big picture. It could be presented in many different communities and events, or I mean, what do you want the outcome to be, or what do you desire the impact of the type of broad scope information that you share to be, specifically in the context of an event like the one in Aspen and the summit we just went to, which is so very specifically about wolves? What's the desired impact?
Yeah, good question. Tough question. I think, I guess my goal as an educator, so I think of myself as a field biologist and researcher first and foremost, but, probably ultimately, maybe my greatest impact will be as an educator. I realize that I've taught, over 10,000 students. Wow. And I give lots of lectures. And I think my goal pedagogically, as it turns out, I didn't set out consciously to do this, but my goal pedagogically is to, ask my, my audience or my students or whomever to kind of reflect on not only the exigencies and the moments and the urgency of this moment in time, but also where we've come from, and where, because this can give us such insight into where we may be going. And so I always challenge folks to pull themselves out of the current moment, to kind of, investigate other ways of thinking, because I really feel like right now we are at, as you guys both know so well, because we're all living through this time together, we are like, we're scared, man. I feel it, my students come into the classroom. I've got, people reaching out to me, and we are living in a time of extraordinary loss, of extraordinary change.
Yeah.
And we can become paralyzed by that, right? And especially if we're stuck in the moment of all we can see is that loss and that crisis. And so by asking my students or my audience members in talks like I gave in Aspen and, in Gardner, I'm asking folks to reflect on the bigger picture of who we are on planet Earth, because I think in so doing that helps to calm that fear a bit and helps to remind us that we do have a history of interacting with wild things, and we can continue to have that history if we do a little work on our end. And so it provides students and audience members and class participants a way of thinking, okay, I got this. This is what I might be able to do. And that is, I think, maybe the greatest gift that we can give each other is to, remind ourselves to take a deep breath, to reflect to pull the lens out a bit, and to overcome that fear so that we can start to make a difference. And so that's all.
Yeah, that's it.
That's all I'm trying to do.
It's pretty simple.
And again, it wasn't none of this, I don't even think about this stuff. I like until I get questions like this. I just go out there and try to just convey what I've learned over the years, because I guess in my own life, I've had a motto of always do the things that scare you the most, and always confront that fear head on. So I know a lot about fear, and I know a lot about being scared, and I know we're living in a world where there's a lot of fear, and I feel that, with wolves, when people have, and maybe this is what people are picking up on. Because I have known fear, because I'm honest about it, I know that people are scared. It's like, wait a minute, we got rid of those things, and now you're going to say, now you're telling us we got to bring them back. And a huge part of that, vast majority of that, is that, people just don't know, they've forgotten. And when you've forgotten and you don't know about a thing, you become, fear can enter into that space. And so I guess I see that as a part of what I do, is trying to overcome all of that.
I just want to, this may be completely out of left field, but I'm just going to try it because it came into my brain here. Whenever we speak to, and I'm sure you've spoken with, obviously, members of the Rocky Mountain Wolf Project, and who are trying to share wolves in a different light in terms of stories and sharing about their pack dynamics and how they're a family, and that wolves have taught us tens of thousands of years ago how to really be the species that we are. Do you find that your work and your research and some of your presentation, because you have that in there, we have been co-evolving with this specific species for a very, very long time. Do you feel that that is a way to enter into those conversations, even though it is educational and can be perceived as sort of highbrow, but you maybe can you can put it in a place where people can understand it, and that they say, oh, so we have known what it's like to be with, in and around this species in particular. Why can't we do it again, or where did we lose our way? Do you ever find those conversations coming up in any of your classes and things?
I do, John. But as you noted, you can't go there right off the bat. Right? And it really requires some sensitivity and insight into whom you're speaking with.
Of course.
Right. If you've got someone that is, not feeling good about, like whatever, in the case of the Yellowstone reintroduction, something that the federal government is doing, or in the case of the Colorado reintroduction, what it feels like is it's the Front Range telling us what to do, right? If you're talking to someone, that has those concerns, going right to that moment, or that, discussion about what wolves can teach us, or how, the deep, long history that we have shared with wolves in the Northern Hemisphere. And that probably won't work, right? You need to absolutely build trust in those settings, and, and mostly just listen, right? Quite honestly. And even with those folks that might not have those concerns and are, upfront about how in support they are of reintroduction, or how much they love wolves, even those folks might not have been thinking about that in a deeper kind of evolutionary historical way. So it's a careful story, right? Like, in the sense of, you can't just launch right into it and just say it, like, as you saw with the talks that you've now seen me give, there you kind of have to unfold pieces of archaeology, some of the genetics, some of the animal behavior, and then you have to situate, well, where were humans 35,000 years ago, right? And then you have to kind of lay out, well, what is, cooperative hunting, And well, what species have cooperative hunting? Well, gray wolves do, and we know that humans historically did. And then you have to kind of carefully unfold what a cooperative breeding system is, that wolves will, in a cooperative way, as a pack, rear offspring just like humans do. There's no individual human that can just by themselves rear their child. Mothers need help. They have aunties or sisters or mothers that are helping, and so you kind of need to build out that all of those pieces of the evidence: genetic, behavioral, paleontological, archaeological. Now, having said that, as you noted, I do teach field seminars for Yellowstone at Yellowstone Park, where I work and where I am engaged in research. And man, you got a sold audience, first of all. But like, when I take class participants and sit, with a scope on like the Junction Butte, den, where there are, pack members coming in, provisioning the puppies, and they're watching the puppies play, and they're seeing, like babysitting puppy, in adults that are babysitting, and they're seeing all of that. Those observations just come naturally. Like, oh, wow, look at that puppy, that reminds me of my dog. And hey, that reminds me of the time I had to feed you when you were growing up.
Right.
So those, like, so showing, and that's the beauty of being able to show animals in the wild. And that's the beauty of Yellowstone, because there's literally no better place on planet Earth to show people wolves. But those kinds of observations, at captive facilities, and as there's some beautiful ones in Colorado and throughout the Rocky Mountain West, where those kinds of behaviors can be observed close hand, and people will arrive at those conclusions on their own. So it's really variable. It depends on the setting that you're in. For sure.
What do you consider your focus when it comes to wolves? I mean, you've of course studied so many different species, but what have you really been focused on specifically around this species? Evolution, diet, behavior, of all of it, of course, to some degree. But how do you dial in your efforts around this species, since there is so much ground to cover, and no one person can, of course, get to all of it?
Yeah. And that I should give a warning. First of all, I've been drinking coffee. Second of all, I'm a academic, and so academics, there's nothing more that they like talking about than their own work, because no one ever asks them typically. So I'm going to try and make this as short as possible. But just just the shorthand version of that is, I am, as we have shifted, and bear with me.
Sure.
I'll get directly to your question. As we have shifted from a rural planet to an urban planet, where there are more humans living in urban and semi-urban and peri-urban landscapes than there are in rural or wild landscapes, wildlife has had to kind of keep a pace, right? They're trying to figure out how to do that as well, because we've transformed those landscapes. And, so basically wildlife have had to kind of keep up, right? And some of those wild species don't keep up, as we know, which is why we're in the midst of the sixth extinction, the biodiversity crisis. Yeah. Other species are keeping up, and and one of those species is coyote, right? In fact, there are some species that do better in areas where there are landscapes of humans than others, and coyotes have increasingly, just their range has, expanded, and they're in every major city and in the United States, and contiguous United States. So that is a big part of my current research right now, is thinking about how wild animals adapt to human-dominated landscapes. And this is the landscape that wolves are trying to make a living in too, right? Clearly, they're not running around in Denver like coyotes are, but they are having to navigate these mosaic landscapes in the Intermountain West, right? Where there are, human impacted landscapes where there are, there's ranches, they're working landscapes. So, there may be ranches, there may be various, smaller outfits, farms and farmettes. And, they are in a position where they need to figure out how to make a living in those landscapes. So one thing that has been popping up around the world is that animals in these human dominated landscapes that are doing okay, there tends to be a certain set of kind of, I don't know, attributes or biological features or behaviors that are popping up. And one of them is boldness. And so what we're seeing is that around the world, whether it's Mumbai or, wherever, that the animals that are doing better tend to be bolder individuals. So what I am looking at in both coyotes and in wolves, two very different circumstances, right? But still two very closely related canids trying to make a living in human dominated landscapes. I am looking at various, genetic markers, endocrine markers, etc., but also boldness. And you can measure boldness in various ways. And this will be behaviorally, and including some experiments that where novel objects are placed into a landscape and animals are kind of videoed as they approach that novel object, and measuring whether they're shy or bold as they approach that novel object is part of that experiment. And so the idea there is getting at hypotheses that might predict that the wolves that are more likely to enter into working landscapes and potentially enter into, a rancher's holdings and take a head of cattle might be those individuals that are more maxed out on that boldness spectrum. And then likewise with coyotes, is it the coyotes that are ending up in places like Denver or wherever, are they more on the end, the spectrum of boldness than they are shyness? And so this ultimately gets at the question of, are we inadvertently, in changing all these landscapes in the way that we're doing, are we inadvertently selecting for bolder species? And are there any signals of evolution? Like, is this an evolutionary thing or is this just a learned thing? And so that is what I'm doing at different sites throughout the West, including Colorado and Yellowstone National Park, and then even outside of Yellowstone National Park in Paradise Valley, and then eventually in places like Eastern Oregon, etc.
Wow.
I'm not quite there yet. It's still developing.
Have you ever read Kara Cassidy's study about toxoplasmosis?
Oh, Kira's work is fantastic. I can't say enough great things about Kira as a scientist. She's awesome. And yes, I'm very, very aware of that study. And, toxoplasmosis is very infectious. And as you know, I know with that leading question, that toxo can result in bolder animals, right? And in fact, we also know that humans can get toxoplasmosis and, all these, CEOs and corporate executive types are more likely to be carrying it than others, which is kind of crazy to think about, But that does add into the whole equation of, how our, current circumstances, even influencing, things like parasite transmission, pathogen transmission, that can then feed back in kind of, reinforcing some of these bold behaviors in the first place.
Wow. Yeah, it's this is all extremely fascinating and interconnected, and you're right, Joanna, it's complicated in a way that until you hear it, you go, okay, wow, there is a lot of different factors into this one thing. With all of that being said, because between the extinction crisis, between the urban settings that were pushing on this wildlife, when you look at the Colorado reintroduction from your perspective, that is now full bore, everything's approved. We spoke with Matt Yamashita, the plan is approved, everything's ready to go. where is your optimistic level at in terms of the way the landscape is ready, the people are ready,
Yep.
the city's ready? Where does your brain sit on, and also the importance maybe of this corridor being put together possibly in the next let's say 3 to 5 years to be safe, and until there's established populations with wolves and everything like that? I know it's a loaded question, a lot of things in there, but just the idea of everything that you've laid out so far in our discussion, how important this reintroduction is now that it's finally moving forward.
Yeah, and just to clarify, John, when you said corridor, did you mean that latitudinal corridor between Mexican gray wolf populations and the
Correct.
Northern
Yes.
Rockies?
Yes.
That's what you mean. Yeah, because that was absolutely part of the, sort of the broader vision of this, right? In the restoration of gray wolves more generally in North America, kind of getting that latitudinal distribution back, like where it was. And again, just for the sake of transparency, I am one of, 5, sort of advisors, board members of the Rocky Mountain Wolf Project, along with my extremely talented colleagues, Gary Skiba, Rob Edwards, Courtney Vale, and Matt Barnes. And previous to 2020, that Rocky Mountain Wolf Project was a very, very large coalition of incredibly dedicated, citizens and legislative types with, that were undertaking a vision that had been put in place by Mike Phillips and also with the passion and drive of Rob Edwards. So I just want to acknowledge all of that, right? And I have been in the thick of this for many, many years. Which means that I just want to be really clear that my perspective on this is as someone that has been working towards this, right? And this has not been part of my day job as a professor and researcher. This has been part of my just, being, I view myself as an advocate on behalf of wild things everywhere and wildness everywhere. And so this was very much a part of all of that. And I am very optimistic for a number of reasons. First of all, the science is there, and that is the beauty of all of the incredible work that has been undertaken at Yellowstone National Park since 1995, right? We know that given half a chance that, gray wolves will flourish, right? They are a generalist species. They have withstood, the Pleistocene epoch. They are the wolf species, or one of a couple, I guess, of extant wolf species that survive the Pleistocene epoch. In the past, historically and paleontologically, there were many, many more species, but it was gray wolves that came to, sort of dominate the Northern Hemisphere. So given half a chance, they do fantastically well. So the science is there. And we had a number of people on the ground doing that work. And you've had almost all of those people on your podcast, which is awesome. And then we also had all of like the ecological and biological elements on the ground here in the Western Slope, right? And this is not something that was just the whim of a handful of advocates, right? We know this since 1994 Bennett report, congressionally mandated evaluation of, the quality and distribution of the range and the prey availability for gray wolves. And it was clear that, the Western Slope could manage at least, 750, 800 animals, if not more. The work that had been going on the ground in terms of sociological surveys to evaluate the social carrying capacity was indicating that, all the markers were there. Right. And then it began to coalesce, and it was pretty clear that because of the success of U.S. Fish and Wildlife, dedication in the Northern Rockies, that it wasn't going to happen in the Western Slope via U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and that another action needed to transpire. And so that's when we, went with a ballot initiative. In terms of my sort of level of optimism, I am very optimistic. I think the Colorado Parks and Wildlife team is, all the pieces are there. The commission, we've got scientists on the commission, we've got ecologists on the commission. There's a new director, Jeff Davis of CPW, that has a vision of rewilding, lead biologist Eric Odell, Eric Brandel, who did her PhD work here in Yellowstone. So there is the talent and the skill there to make it happen. Now, I don't want to be a Pollyanna. Wolves will take cattle. They already have taken cattle. There will be conflict. There will be, difficult conversations and difficult decisions that will need to be made. And I've been in the trenches of conservation for 35 plus years. I know what happens when elephants leave a forest reserve. I know what happens when tigers leave a forest reserve. I know what happens when a gray wolf leaves a protected area and goes into human-dominated landscapes. And so I am not a Pollyanna about this. But what I am optimistic about is that we've got the toolkit of non-lethal coexistence measures that have been formulated by, folks, working for USDA. A great piece just came out a couple of weeks ago by Stuart Breck and his colleagues. This was USDA work on using robotics to, offset and deter predation by wolves and other carnivores on cattle. And then, so we've got the tools, we've got the talent at CPW, we've got the science from the Northern Rockies, and then we've got folks in nonprofits, like Rocky Mountain Wolf Project, like, so many others, Working Circle, Defenders of Wildlife, so many folks on the ground talking, trying to make a difference, making sure that we're showing up to talk to those individuals whose lives will be impacted much more than, the lives of those folks that are living in the Front Range.
Yeah.
So the costs of this reintroduction are not evenly spread. The costs and the benefits are not evenly spread, and we have to acknowledge the costs while also working towards a vision of making our world a place that can sustain both wildlife and humans on the same landscape.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. I don't know if you can well, speaking of this, I don't know if you can touch on this idea. It seems, at least, that Colorado does have a lot of the needs of wolves covered in terms of space in a simplistic sense, and prey, speaking broadly about numbers. But there are a lot more people in Colorado than in Montana. I could be wrong, but I think there are it's like just short of 6 million people in Colorado and a little more than 1 million in Montana. So that must be a thought in the minds of everyone in the advisory group. So what has been the conversation around that fact, and how does it change anything when you compare it to the Montana reintroductions, which I assume is where the advisory board is pulling a lot of inspiration, at least?
Well, keep in mind that most of those individuals, you're absolutely right. There are way more people in Colorado than there are in Montana or Idaho or wherever. But most of those individuals are in the Front Range. They're in Denver, in that whole Colorado Springs. It's that corridor, right? The I-25 corridor all the way up to, through Fort Collins. And then it starts petering out up towards Cheyenne. So there's that part of it. And there are a number of conservation biologists, myself included, that, as we think about the way forward on planet Earth and how to sustain animals and humans, our burgeoning population, it's increasingly evident that where most people need to be is in cities. As much as we, folks might want to live not in cities, that's where we got to stay to protect some of this wild space. So keep that in mind. That's an important caveat. The other part of it is that once you sort of take that into account, you look at total density, i.e. the total number of humans per unit area on the Western Slope versus in areas in the Northern Range, the Northern Rockies, it's about comparable. Okay. So the area that, we, in terms of protected public lands, state and federal, on the Western Slope is roughly, sort of 21, 22 million, right? On the Western Slope, as you know, Yellowstone National Park is 2.2 million. Now, the greater Yellowstone ecosystem is vastly larger than just Yellowstone, right? Clearly. And, it's a very large and completely contiguous area. So that is a consideration, right? Like when you look at the greater Yellowstone ecosystem in the Northern Rockies relative to the Western Slope, the distribution and the patterning of the contiguousness of the protected area is different. And so that is why having, there's more of a mosaic on the Western Slope of those public lands versus working landscapes, which is why it's so critical that we have boots on the ground and, trainings in place and workshops of those folks that are going to incur, the potential greatest threat of wolves leaving public lands into working landscapes. That's where the science comes in. That's where the state agency comes in. That's where the work of the nonprofits comes in.
When you say all that, and because we all three of us I think we were a week out from being at the Yellowstone Wolf Summit, did you find those conversations with the groups and the folks that were there that this is something that could be pushed forward, not only in helping the Colorado reintroduction in terms of education, coexistence tools, and manifesting and garnering funds for those that are going to be living with wolves on the Western Slope, but also in other conservation efforts as it comes through, because we know grizzly bears are coming down, the legislative pike, mountain lions, any apex predator seems to be sort of on the docket for a lot of these individuals in Congress and these state legislators about hunting them or lowering their numbers. Do you feel that there was the gathering that was there seems more in line, like we're going to work together and we're going to educate and push these things forward, seeing that Colorado is working as well as it is? Did you get that vibe from when we left there?
That's a good question, John. And there was, largely that was a group of wolf advocates, right? It was not so much a science conference, right? It was a lot of folks and also folks that are engaged in litigation and, above and beyond just advocacy. But, and moreover, there was just a breadth of topics that were covered. In terms of the wolf Colorado, I think there was my sort of big talk on day one, and then, one other that was given, and then it came up quite a bit in the panel discussion right in the end. And there are varying perspectives, as you heard there. There were critiques of the way that the restoration, the whole reintroduction sort of initiative, the Rocky Mountain Wolf Project initiative, was formulated. How I would respond to that is, A, we got the job done, and B, it's easy to look back with hindsight and critique, especially if you weren't part of the team that was putting together the project itself. And the important thing about issues and critiques about a project is that you learn from those, right? And it becomes an adaptive sort of adaptive hypothesis testing, meaning next time around, when this is done, those concerns will be addressed. Now, to your question about whether this could be done elsewhere, I absolutely believe that this could, and in fact, I've had colleagues that have reached out to me and asked this, that this can serve as a template, a model for things that can get to, making things happen at the state level. I do want to I clarify that the reason why what we did in Colorado was so sort of remarkable is that this was the first time that this has occurred with an endangered species, a species that's on the Federal Registry of Endangered Species. I bring that up because there are other actions at the state level and at the local level that have taken place. You guys know, in California, right? So there are other initiatives that, and that are voted on by citizens and by activists at every level of local to state about the wildlife in those states. What distinguishes what we did here is, and I should clarify that those kinds of actions are on species that are not on the Federal Registry. Why this is different is because at the time of going to the general election in November 2020, gray wolves were on the endangered species list, and they were removed, as you know, the following January for a 10-month period. They are now back on. So this action is taking place with an endangered species, and one that is conspicuous and charismatic and has been on the list since 1974. And so that is why this is special. And because it's the first time a species is being reintroduced, not by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife or by NOAA, which deals with marine and coastal species, right? So that's why this is special. And I, again, as someone that has been doing this for years and seen how much work can go into something that never actually transpires, and then having to carry that weight of something that failed. For someone like me, when that vote went in and when the Wolf Plan was approved in May, and to me, not only does this represent another tool in the toolkit of our conservation action plans that could serve as a model to other states, to me, this gives such a source of agency and hope to an individual, right? That we are not at the whim of, oh, maybe some politician might consider lobbying for X, no, right? This is something that we can take into our own hands and make happen. And in a world, full circle back to where I started, in a world where people are despairing of the biodiversity crisis and feeling paralyzed and scared, having a piece of hope, man, maybe we can get this done. That to me is added value, not only, and again, I was transparent about the fact that I was part of trying to make this happen. So, I was on the political campaign ads, it was me saying, vote yes. So, I have to be really forthcoming about the fact that I'm biased in this. But I don't care because, wildlife can't do this on their own. And so if we aren't willing to step up and, take some risks like I did as an academic in the world of advocacy, then, what are you going to do? Roll over? Right. My answer to that is no.
Do you see, I just have a couple more things before we tap out here. Do you see a shift, whether it's in the classroom, out giving speeches and talks, out in the field? There is this shift of individuals and groups willing to coexist, to find these, use these practices to work with wildlife as opposed to butt up against it? Or do you see that it's more of in other words, that people are starting to understand the ecological crisis, or understanding, those that are living out in these rural areas, that we can coexist, we can live with these predators, these animals, and work with them?
Yeah, I absolutely. So I have two answers to that. First of all, I think most importantly, I absolutely have talked to folks that are making a living in working landscapes in various ways that are absolutely, everyone's aware of what
Right.
we're losing. This is not, folks that, everyone is, there are fewer animals and there's there's less space for those animals to be in. So this is not a surprise to anyone. And absolutely, I talk to people that are making a living on working landscapes that are like, yeah, they were here first. And, I don't like having them around because I've got to think about my family and how I'm going to earn a living, but it's just as much their place as mine. So I'm going to make it work. So I very much encounter that attitude. And so there's that part of it. I also encounter other attitudes that might be much less favorable, but even amongst those folks, there's absolutely an awareness of the fact that there's less habitat and less, fewer animals. So there's that part. The other part, though, the kind of flip side of that is that a lot of this is happening so bloody quickly that like our heads are spinning, right? Like when I first was in the classroom, decades ago teaching, I wasn't talking about the biodiversity extinction crisis. Conservation biology as a discipline wasn't even a discipline. There wasn't even a journal of conservation biology back then.
Right.
So this is, and the rate of change and what we're losing is so fast that our heads are spinning. And wildlife showing up in downtown Mumbai or downtown Denver is a recent phenomenon. So so in some ways, a lot of this is like whiplash, like, holy crap, whoa, wait, 1 million species are about to go extinct if they haven't already. And oh my God, I got to figure out how to live with large body predators because I don't want the world to, collapse. This is a new thing. And we're all trying to figure it out.
Yeah, it is. It is. I was thinking of this recently. It is a really scary time. And even if not consciously, it feels like it's in the air or it's in the energy of the world. It seems everybody seems to know, even if they don't know.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? But it also seems like with very few mistakes and a few more undesirable changes, we could see a lot more species go extinct. And it's a really scary time. But my last, I have a bunch of questions, but we're gonna try to end it in an hour. Well, so you visited so many countries and you've worked on more than a handful of projects, of course, and all of them, I assume, come with an element of contention and the issues of social tolerance, because that's kind of, across the board. What are some clear to you common themes that exist in all of these wildlife issues?
Wow. The species are different, the landscapes are different, the languages spoken in the local area are different, the issues are the same.
Yeah.
People need to earn a living. People are worried about their children. It doesn't matter if you're in Denver or Kigali or, Emigrant Montana.
Yeah.
People are worried about their future. People are worried about their own health and safety. And that is what we're butting up against, right? And it's this intersection of where the world of animals that are trying to make a living, because think about it, it's the same things for animals. They're trying to make a living. They're trying to find enough food to feed their offspring. They're trying to find a mate, whatever. And so it's when those two worlds meet that we get something that has been called human wildlife conflict, right? And that's the stuff that's happening so fast that we've got whiplash, as I mentioned. And that's where we're working. That's where people like myself and so many others are working, is right at that intersection of where wildlife is trying to make a living and humans are trying to make a living. How do we make that work? We don't need to worry so much about how people are making a living in downtown Denver, right? We do need to worry about how people are going to make a living in areas around, Aspen or wherever, or around where I work in Uganda, or, where myself and a colleague, Amanda Schronzer, are going to be working in Nepal. So there's, and the species are different. I've seen it, like when an elephant is trying to figure out how to make a living and goes into somebody's, area, and in a night takes an entire year's worth of food and potentially kills someone, when, 380,000 people have died from tiger in India alone in the last couple hundred years. The intensity and the rate and it can be different, but the issues are the same. Regardless of the species, and including species like chimpanzees that I've worked with, right? That are, one thinks of them as being, sort of in a, some, remote forest, far away from people, doing what chimpanzees do. But the reality is that those remote forests are now islands. And they need, just like the bison need to leave northern Yellowstone, just like elephants need to leave Kibale, those chimps need to leave their space as well, and the same conflict everywhere. So working at that intersection is where we got to be. And as again, I could talk forever, and I love this stuff, and I just love you guys for the questions you're asking me. But I will always end on optimism. I will. It's imperative. I tell my students, in the first week of my conservation biology course here at University of Colorado Boulder, we spend that first week talking about optimism and what you need to do to meditate on optimism. What does that look like? And because if we, it's easy to be pessimistic, right? Oh, this isn't going to work. Oh, no way. Oh, that's not going to work. Oh, we're doomed. Oh, yeah, that's easy. I could wake up every day feeling like that. But it's hard work to remain optimistic. And that is what we got to do. All of this is hard work, but we got ourselves into this pickle. So we got to, we don't have the luxury of just sitting back and letting it happen, right? We got to get out there. And I guess that's what I see myself doing, right? I don't know. I'll do this till I draw my last breath, I think.
That seems like that would be the way you would go. My final question for you, Joanna, is when you hear the word wolf, what's the thing that comes to your mind?
Oh, wolf, gosh. Oh, wow. John, that's so hard, because now I could talk for another 2 hours. I think wolf is part of our narrative. It is now part, not only is it part of my own personal story for X number of years, trying to get him back here to Colorado, and now, being amongst them in Yellowstone, it is part of our human story, our human story as, we left Africa as a baby species and entered into Eurasia and eventually North America. The species we were running into that continues today, that continues to vex us in one way or another, but also, charm us, is wolf. And I would say that wolf is part of every human story that can be told, especially in the northern hemisphere where wolves are. But wolves also were in lower latitudes, historically. And so I guess that's how I would respond to that. Wolf is part of my personal history and is part of the narrative of Homo sapien.
I love that.
Yep.
That's terrific. That's a first
Yep.
that I think that we've heard.
Mm-hmm.
Joanna, just tell everybody where they can see your escapades if possible, where they can look at the work that you're doing with what the Lambert Lab is doing. Just give everybody quickly where they can look those things up and keep track of all the research you and your awesome students are doing.
Yeah, thank you. And I do want to acknowledge, all my graduate students who are remarkable and put up with me as I gallivant around the world and spend, because I leave as soon as I upload my grades, I'm in my car or in a plane going somewhere. So I do want to acknowledge them. So I would say, I'm pretty. I can be found pretty readily on the web. Best place to go is probably my website, which is just I feel like a used car salesman right now, but www.joannalambert.com is the easiest place to find me. I'm fairly good at keeping my website up to date. But again, joannalambert.com. I have my students on there. I've got to kind of update that, but my students, I've got descriptions of my research. I've got all my publications. I've got some news stories up there. I've got a lot on there. So, and then I welcome and encourage your listeners to reach out, to me. I'm just joanna.lambert@colorado.edu. And I'm also, I love talking to people. Nice. So
that's great. Joanna, this has been extremely informative again. Your passion is incredible. And again, you're one of those that we're lucky to have you in the spaces where you are, which is everywhere. So thank you for spending time with Stephen and I, for telling everyone about your research and continuing to do the work to help these species, help the wild places and spaces around the globe. We can't thank you enough for all that you do.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you guys both, to Stephen and John, and thank you not only for inviting me, but thank you for doing the good work, because all of this needs to be a conversation, and your podcast, I know, is so heavily subscribed to, and I know you're reaching a lot of people, and Wolf Connection in general, just the whole philosophy is such an inclusive one and such a healing one, and I really appreciate that. So
thank you.
Awesome. You. Thank you, Joanna.
Yeah, come visit me in the field sometime. You'll see just how crazy I am out there.
The thing is, it'll have to be a floating pin because you're never in one place. So we'll have to knock you, drag you down somewhere. All right. Joanna, thank you so much. Just stick around for just a moment once we sign off. But how's to everybody out there? And Stephen, I'll be with you next time. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Looking for more information about Wolf Connection or the podcast? Please visit our website at wolfconnection.org, where you can donate, sponsor a wolf, or become a volunteer.